Recently, international media have been circulating a rather strange story involving Donald Trump, one that has left many people both surprised and perplexed. The story goes that during a closed-door meeting with nearly 20 leaders of major private oil companies from around the world, Trump suddenly received a small note from the U.S. Secretary of State. By convention, this was clearly private information intended solely for the recipient and not meant to be known by anyone else in the room. What stunned everyone present, however, was that Trump casually announced out loud that the secretary had just sent him a note and then proceeded to read its entire contents aloud. He did not skim it silently in his head. He read it clearly, audibly, and distinctly enough for cameras and reporters to capture every word. What was supposedly a confidential message instantly became public knowledge in front of thousands. While public debate was still focused on analyzing why Trump would behave in such a manner, there was another detail quieter, less conspicuous, but far more important that went largely unnoticed. In that very meeting, Trump called on private oil companies around the world to contribute roughly $100 billion to invest in Venezuela. It was an enormous sum, and a destination fraught with risk. So, what did this really mean? At first glance, many people immediately assumed this was a plan to push China out of Venezuela and reclaim control over oil, fields that American companies had once operated in the past. And once again, a familiar narrative emerged: the United States using political power to pressure a weaker country and seize its strategic resources. But when examined more closely, the situation is far more complicated than that conventional interpretation. Many assume that all it would take is political pressure, forcing the Venezuelan government to hand over oil extraction rights, and American oil companies would automatically reap the benefits of those massive reserves. In reality, today's Venezuela is no longer the Venezuela of its golden age. After years of nationalization, poor management, and chronic underinvestment, the entire oil infrastructure has deteriorated severely. Oil wells are damaged, processing facilities are nearly paralyzed, pipelines are corroded, and there are acute shortages of electricity, chemical additives, and skilled technical labor. The oil may still be there underground, but it cannot be extracted efficiently without rebuilding almost everything from scratch. For this reason, experts estimate that restoring Venezuela's oil industry would require at least around $100 billion in initial investment. That is why Trump did not speak about taking oil, but instead called for pouring money in. In other words, the United States would not be bringing oil home anytime soon. It would first have to commit an enormous amount of capital. Meanwhile, Venezuela itself has for years lacked the financial capacity to save its own oil sector. Between roughly 2007 and 2016, China pledged more than $60 billion in loans to Venezuela. Yet the funds actually disbursed were still insufficient to rebuild the entire oil industry. Debt piled upon debt, the economy collapsed, inflation spiraled out of control, and everyday life for ordinary people fell into crisis. As of today, oil wells continue to deteriorate, and refineries stand on the brink of shutting down completely. From Venezuela's perspective, then, a $100 billion investment package is almost a lifeline thrown within reach. Of course, over the long term, dependence on the United States would be difficult to avoid. But in the current context, crushing debt, widespread unemployment, and collapsing infrastructure, there are virtually no real alternatives left. The crucial point is that such an investment cannot be done halfway. In the oil industry, $10 or even $20 billion barely solves anything. To get the system running again, reconstruction must be comprehensive. Oil wells, processing plants, pipelines, power systems, logistics, and security all have to be rebuilt together. Leave out one link and the entire chain fails to function. It is like repairing a car that has been flooded. Replacing the interior without fixing the engine leaves the car immobile. Fixing the engine while ignoring the electrical system is equally pointless. If you do it, you have to do it properly, all the way through. If the United States truly manages to inject $100 billion into Venezuela, the immediate benefits for the country would be obvious. Millions of unemployed people would find work: oil engineers, mechanics, construction workers, transport operators, traders, and service staff in everything from catering to logistics. This massive flow of capital would generate ripple effects across the economy for years. In fact, $100 billion is nearly equivalent to Venezuela's GDP in a recent year, underscoring the sheer scale of its potential impact. Even if it remains unclear how many barrels of oil the United States could extract in the short term, Venezuela would, in the meantime, be facing mountains of work simply to rebuild the country. According to some estimates from international energy consulting firms, the long-term goal often mentioned is to bring Venezuela's oil production back to around 3 million barrels per day, roughly matching its peak output from decades ago. But to reach that level, the total required investment could approach $200 billion. In that light, the $100 billion Trump called for would in fact cover only a little more than half of what is truly needed. And this is where the problem becomes even more complex, because raising $100 billion is already difficult, while mobilizing the full amount required in an environment of high political risk is even more challenging. This is precisely the biggest bottleneck in the plan Trump is pursuing. But the story does not end with how much money is needed or what Venezuela might gain in the short term. The bigger question is why most major oil companies have been hesitant or even outright unwilling to respond to Trump's call, despite the fact that, at least in theory, Venezuela possesses some of the largest oil reserves in the world. At that meeting, Trump promised that if these companies invested in Venezuela, they would be rewarded with very attractive returns. Yet the reaction from many corporate leaders was one of weary head-shaking. Particularly striking was the attitude of several American oil companies that had operated in Venezuela for decades in the past. These were not companies unfamiliar with the country's potential. On the contrary, they knew better than anyone just how oil-rich Venezuela is. And precisely because they know it so well, they are even more cautious. In the past, these companies spent tens of billions of dollars building oil wells, refineries, pipelines, and extraction systems. Then, with a single political decision, all of those assets were nationalized, seized with little to no compensation, and effectively wiped out. That memory is still far too fresh for them to easily place their trust in today's promises. Another concern that keeps these corporations from taking the plunge is the issue of time and politics. Even if Trump can guarantee favorable policies during his own term, that term will not last forever. Rebuilding Venezuela's oil industry is not a project that takes a few years. It could easily stretch 15 years or more. No one can be certain that after a new president takes office, U.S. policy will remain the same. If a future administration comes to power with priorities focused on limiting oil production for environmental reasons, or with a different geopolitical agenda altogether, today's commitments could quickly become meaningless. Even in the most optimistic scenario, where the United States continues to protect the interests of oil companies, there remains a much larger question. Who can guarantee that Venezuela itself will not change its mind yet again? History has shown that when political conditions shift, economic agreements can be reversed with alarming speed. If a new government in Venezuela decides to renationalize the oil industry, foreign companies would once again face the risk of losing everything. At that point, what would the United States do? Using military force would invite condemnation for bullying a smaller nation. Pursuing international legal action would not be much more effective, as past lawsuits have dragged on for decades without clear results, especially when Venezuela is close to default and lacks the ability to pay. On top of all this, oil extraction in Venezuela is itself an extremely difficult and costly technical challenge. The oil there is extra heavy crude, containing high levels of heavy metals and sulfur. This makes extraction, transportation, and processing far more complex than dealing with the light crude found in the Middle East. In places like Saudi Arabia, simply injecting water can be enough to push oil to the surface. In Venezuela, however, operators must inject hot steam to thin the oil before it can be pumped out. Once extracted, the oil tends to thicken again as it cools, requiring continuous heating or dilution with additives just to keep it flowing through pipelines. These steps cause costs to skyrocket. Not only do steam generation facilities need to be built, but enormous amounts of energy are required to run them. Oil with high sulfur and heavy metal content also corrodes pipelines and storage tanks more quickly, forcing companies to use higher-grade, far more expensive materials. As a result, the cost of producing a barrel of oil in Venezuela is significantly higher than in many other regions. While a barrel of oil in the Middle East may cost only around $20 to produce, in Venezuela the cost can reach $30 or $40, or even higher in some cases. And that is without factoring in sanctions, which make importing additives and technical equipment into Venezuela far more difficult, requiring multiple intermediaries and pushing costs even higher. All of this severely erodes profit margins, especially when global oil prices are not high. Ironically, Trump himself has repeatedly stated his desire to keep oil prices low to support U.S. industry and consumers. If oil prices hover around $50 per barrel, the profit margins for expensive projects like those in Venezuela become extremely thin. Taken together, these factors turn investments in Venezuela into a high-risk, low-reward gamble. It requires not only enormous capital, but also the willingness to accept political, legal, and technical risks that could last for decades. Even the $100 billion Trump has called for is not a sum that any single company could easily commit on its own. To raise that amount would require consortia of multiple corporations, and the more parties involved, the more complicated profit sharing, risk allocation, and strategic alignment become. There is also another factor that is often overlooked: taxes and profit-sharing obligations with the Venezuelan government. Even if preferential terms existed in the past, any return of foreign companies would almost certainly come with demands to contribute to the national budget. This further weakens the attractiveness of the profit equation. Viewed as a whole, even if the United States were to secure the right to extract oil in Venezuela, the road ahead would still be extraordinarily difficult. The country's condition is far worse than many people imagine. It is not only oil wells that are broken. The power grid, transportation networks, security, and supply chains have all deteriorated severely. Restoration cannot happen in a matter of months or a year, or to it could take an entire decade. So even if, on paper, the United States obtains extraction rights, turning those rights into actual oil and real money is an entirely different story. If private capital cannot be mobilized, the U.S. government might consider using public funds. But that would require approval from Congress, where opposition from rival political parties would be fierce. And that is why, up to now, the massive investment plan for Venezuela has remained largely at the level of appeals and debate rather than concrete commitments. Whether Trump can solve this higher-risk equation, and whether Venezuela can truly be revived by external capital or will instead fall into a new cycle of dependence, remains an open question. For now, all that can be done is to keep watching and see where this story ultimately leads.